Welcome to Corporate Law Lab. I'm Neil Taylor, Director of the Corporate Law Center at the University of Cincinnati, and today we are joined by Jordan Bleznick. Jordan worked for many years with the noted investor Carl Icahn, and we will talk about Icahn through the lens of tax over the next however many episodes this turns out to be. So welcome, Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil.
So you grew up in Cincinnati, that's right?
Yeah, you officially grow up in Cincinnati if you go to high school there. And
Exactly.
I went to what I perceived to be one of the better high schools, which was Walnut Hills.
So you do know what the first question to any Cincinnatian is: where did you go
Where
to
you went to high school. You could have gone, if you went to Yale, which I didn't, that wasn't as important.
And your father was a UC professor in Spanish literature, right?
Correct. His specialty was the 16th century El Don Quixote. And he taught at UC for over 30 years, about 30 years.
And you went to undergrad here.
I went to undergrad at Cincinnati, and I did a little twist. I went to law school at Ohio State. But when they play each other, I root for Cincinnati.
As one should. You have to be true to your undergrad.
For the most part.
Yeah.
For the most part.
I would definitely, if Indiana played Cincinnati, I'd have to root for Indiana.
All right. We'll talk later.
So you were telling me before about when your father had a semester, I think it was, in
A sabbatical.
A sabbatical, okay.
Yeah.
In Spain in the early 60s.
Correct. I was in third grade at the time. I left third grade in the middle of the year and went with my sister and parents to Madrid. And in those days, it was 1964, Franco was still around. He wasn't dead yet.
Yeah.
Franco was around. There were really no public schools. And they said, my father said, I got this Catholic school that you can go to. And we went over to the Catholic school. I didn't really speak much Spanish. My father spoke fluent Spanish, says to the head priest or whatever, the head of the school, he says, I have something to tell you. My son is not from Madrid. And the headmaster said, occasionally we take somebody from Valencia. Valencia is another city in Spain that nobody goes to. But
right.
the whole thing of it was, I'm Jewish. And if he had said I was Jewish, I would not have gone to that school. Also, I didn't know much Spanish, so the first day I was put into third grade. I sat in the middle. They sat you by height. I sat in the middle of the class. They asked me questions. I had no idea. Next day, I go to school. They point to por allí, a different room. I was now in second grade and in second grade, I sat closer to the back of the room because I was bigger. And I still didn't know what they were telling me. The third day I went to school, they said, por allí, kindergarten. First grade. They sent me to first grade. And finally, they made an extra row for me in the back of the room. Finally, I understood it because all you had to do was, read. I could read Spanish. I just didn't know the language very well. So I was in first grade. I was very popular. I was the biggest kid by far in the class. And my parents, let me go back and forth. It seemed like an eternity, but it was probably only a matter of weeks. And one day I came home and my mother said, what did you learn in school today? And I started doing the catechism. Next day I was in a different school. So that's my Spanish sabbatical story.
But did you maintain your fluency in Spanish after you left?
Well, I learned some Spanish then. I took a lot of Spanish in high school and college.
Yeah.
I've been to Spain several times. I don't call myself fluent, but I'm proficient. I can communicate pretty well, except in certain countries, like Cuba. I was in Cuba. I could not. They omit like consonants and stuff.
Yeah, when I moved from Cincinnati to Phoenix, I said to my wife, "Don't worry, I know enough Spanish; it'll be fine." And I had no idea that Sonoran Spanish is very, very slangy.
Yeah.
And I thought, "Oh my God, I've completely lost my Spanish. I have no idea what these people are saying." And then years later, when I worked for Millicom, which had the Tigo brand, and we were in 6 countries in Latin America, and I was with the Guatemalans and Colombians and Paraguayans, I was like, I understand these guys. It wasn't me, it was them.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different types of Spanish.
Yeah. So why did you decide to go to get, you got an LLM at NYU in taxation, correct?
Right. 19, just to, I'll admit how ancient I am. 1980. I got my LLM in tax at NYU.
Well, just to show how ancient I am, I was almost out of high school by then, so it's not
Right.
like you're.
You're on the accelerated program.
Yeah. Yeah, I was 5, but in high school. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I really had NYU in tax has always been well known, but it wasn't that popular, especially in Ohio back then. And I didn't really even think about what kind of law I wanted to practice, but I was always a good problem solver, a good numbers guy. And I talked to one of my dad's friends, a guy named Richard Schwartz, and he said, "Jordan, go to this program. It's a 1-year program. When you come back, I'll hire you and you'll work for me." Schwartz, that was the Schwartz firm I was talking about.
Right.
So I go to the program. I do pretty well, or, well enough. And then a firm in Columbus, Ohio, which was about a 30-lawyer firm, those were how big the firms were in those days, offered me a job at a much higher salary. So I had to tell Richard I couldn't come.
Then how did you find your way back from Columbus to New York? Because you spent the bulk of your professional career in New York, right?
Correct. I spent like 90% of my professional career in New York. The real truth to the matter is I worked in Columbus. I always liked New York. And my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, and then my divorced wife, was from New York. And we got engaged in Columbus. I said, "I'll live in New York," because I always had wanted to go to New York. It gave me the excuse. So pretty much I moved to New York in the early 80s, and I started working at a middle-sized firm. In those days, 30, 40 lawyers you could be a quote-unquote full-service law firm at 30 or 40 lawyers or 50 lawyers. And I started working for them in 1984.
And then shortly after you joined, you met Carl Icahn.
Correct. In 1984, Carl did his first big deal, which we may talk about later, the American Car and Foundry, ACF, railcar deal. I did not work on that deal, but we started working right after that deal. So pretty much right after that deal, up until 2023, I had, working on Carl's stuff. Not in the law firm, not necessarily exclusively, but he was the main client.
And so how did you meet him, and how did you start to, because I think you have told me that for most of the time after the first few years, he was your main client until you left and went in-house with him, right?
Right. Well, I was a relatively junior associate who eventually evolved into a junior partner. There was a senior partner over me. Not to get into too much drudgery, the senior partner was not beloved by the Icahn organization, and in fact by most people. But after a period of years, when it became evident that even though I wasn't talking to Carl all the time, I kept working on more and more Carl stuff, more and more Icahn stuff. Finally, I started talking to him, and so the relationship went pretty well between me and Carl, to the point where he decided that he wanted to have a general counsel and a couple other counsel, and I call myself a general tax counsel. So in 2001, he actually, which is unusual, I wasn't, he views his employees as distressed assets. And I was one of the few people he ever hired that was actually working a legitimate job. He came, in other words, he pursued me.
Right. He wasn't somebody that.
I mean, pursuing by Carl isn't exactly a bunch of chocolates and roses.
So, Carl is extremely well known. One of the first people that would have been described in the press as a corporate raider.
Exactly.
And I think he describes himself as an activist investor.
Yeah.
How is there a difference, or is just one a nicer name for the other?
Well, there's a little bit of a difference. And by the way, if any of people want to type in the word corporate raider, I did that this morning into Google. You usually see a picture of Carl. So at least on my version. So
literally, when they say about people, you look up in the dictionary and you see their picture next to it. It's literally true of Carl in the words corporate raider.
It's literally true. You see an AI picture of Carl. And
so, how would you describe his approach?
yeah, well, let's answer the first question.
Okay.
The first question is, to me, and I think to anybody, when Carl first started out, he would go out and buy positions in companies that he studied by looking at 10Ks and talking to people. No real inside information. One of his first companies was Tappan in Mansfield, Ohio. He would go out to a company. He would then, he'd buy shares. He'd accumulate some stock. He'd then call up the company and said, by the way, I'm your shareholder. And, unless you do X, Y, and Z, he would tell them what he thought was wrong with the company. He was looking for undervalued companies. He would tell them flat out what was wrong with their company. He would maybe start a proxy fight where he would try to get on the board of directors. In the early days of Carl, the deals were smaller. They just bought him out. That's what a raider really is. A raider goes in and fights and stuff, and he's bought out, doesn't help the other shareholders. Now he morphed into a activist, and I won't say this was intentional, but they changed some of the rules. And they had, in the 1980s, thanks to John Danforth, in the 1980s, they started enacted a very little-known green mail excise tax, which in effect said you couldn't go into a company and have yourself bought out on terms better than the other shareholders.
And Danforth was a senator from Missouri.
Danforth, well, we'll get to Dan. Our two biggest operating companies for the first 20 years were both in Missouri.
Got it.
One was TWA and one was ACF. They were both out of St. Louis.
Okay.
So Danforth was one of the proponents of the green mail excise tax. Some states started proposing rules. Ohio has a green mail statute now. So that, I think, was the difference. But as far as his tactics, they weren't that much different.
Okay. What was unusual about his methodology?
I think the best you can say is Carl was unusual. But, he didn't necessarily invent the proxy fight. He didn't necessarily invent letter writing campaigns. But he had the word chutzpah, okay, since we're going to talk about Yiddish. He had the ability of, basically saying he didn't really care if he was talked about negatively. He didn't go out there and say, hey, he didn't preserve his quote unquote, I'm good Carl Icahn.
Right.
He really didn't. So he would go into a company and he'd pull out anything. He would write all kinds of nasty letters. Up until this day, he wrote nasty letters telling them what they're doing wrong with the company and they should spin something off, they should sell something. And he would be dogged in his determination. One of the main differences is there's something called a hedge fund, which is really just another way to say investment fund, where they invest in usually non-controlling positions. And there's something called a private equity fund, where people get together and they take a company, a controlling interest in a company, and they take it private, and then they may take it public again. Carl, through his holding company, Icahn Enterprises, did both things. So he owned most of the holding company. So he wasn't beholden to anybody. Hedge funds had to care because they couldn't hold investments for long periods of time because they needed liquidity to buy, to redeem their shareholders, to give money back to their investors.
So with a hedge fund, investors, and we're generalizing here, but with a hedge fund, investors can come in and go out kind of at their pleasure.
Yeah, well, there's usually a schedule.
Right.
There's, like a schedule with, a schedule at the end of each year, at the end of 2 years, some kind of schedule where you can withdraw your money.
And
typically not longer than 2, maybe rarely 3 years. So a hedge fund, for that reason and other reasons, one of the other reasons is a hedge fund wouldn't want to buy controlling interest in a company. It would go against its diversification.
whereas a private equity fund, you usually have a sponsor.
Exactly.
And the general partner will be the name on the door. Like, I don't know, the one I worked with was Helios Investment Partners.
Right.
But there are many others like that. For some reason, Pershing Capital comes to mind because it'll come up later.
Right. I think I know. I've heard of Pershing Capital. But he had the ability to stick for years with investments, as we may talk about later.
Well, and he did, right?
He did. His ACF, his first operating company, went from 84, and in some ways went until 2018. So that was his longest standing.
Right. And there's no, most private equity funds, even if they are in it.
No, they usually do 7.
Yeah, exactly. Their LPs expect to get out after 7 to 10 years.
Right. I mean, in all fairness, Carl never was very good in the sandbox. He didn't want to. He was much better when he could do his own thing.
He didn't want to have partners that had a different
Initially, he had to have partners. Actually, his uncle fronted him a few $100,000, 40 years ago. But he was better when he controlled the situation and didn't have to answer.
And to do that, he must have needed a pretty good-sized war chest.
Yeah, well, what he did was he used his holding company to borrow billions of dollars on the theory that, borrowing wasn't that cheap, maybe 6-7%, depends on the time, going back 30 years. And he would have money. He also did own the investment positions that he bought and sold and didn't hold for a long period of time that were non-controlling. He had the ability to margin to borrow against the securities. And so he would keep in a certain amount of cash, knowing that that gave him the ability to act at any time on any given company.
So his methodology made tax more important to him than probably most other hedge funds or PE funds.
Yeah, I wanted to start an organization of activist tax lawyers, and I couldn't really find anybody. It's a little more common now that, hedge funds don't really need tax lawyers because they don't take controlling positions. They buy and sell. That's not to say they don't have complicated issues on derivatives and certain things, but it's not as compelling as what Carl did in terms of tax. I worked both on the investment side and the hedge fund side, and I was the one that sort of said, okay, if we have a gain from one, can we offset it with a loss from the other? It was like, it was a pretty challenging job and pretty rewarding. We had our target on how much tax we pay each year. I won't tell you what it was.
Somewhere north of zero?
Well, if you include All taxes, yes.
Okay. So what was Carl had his own version of cash flow, right?
Right.
Carl
And
cash.
that was a big thing for Carl. Carl was big on cash flow. And he didn't like all these accounting adjustments for non-cash items. So, I mean, he called it Carl cash flow. And honestly, what it was pretty much EBITDA, which is earnings before depreciation and amortization and interest, which he had a lot of. So he took it one step further and he said, I'll take EBITDA, which was what we just described, and then I'll subtract maintenance, what they call maintenance CapEx, which is a piece of CapEx. The other piece of CapEx is growth. They usually put it together.
Right.
So maintenance, you could apply to any company and say, how much money are they spending to maintain the current company? So that way, if one company was a growth company versus another company was more like a value or, which he tended to go toward, he could come back and get a core value based on what he called Carl cash flow.
Yeah, and back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of, I don't want to call it skullduggery, but there's some adjective close to that, of how you reported your earnings, where you would have special charges. So a company would come out and say, well, we lost 20 million this quarter. However, excluding special items, we actually gained 100 million, and aren't we great?
Yeah. Yeah, if you take out the losing items, you have a bigger profit.
Yeah, and some companies you would see, I mean, I worked at places where people would hang on to their problems for as long as they could, waiting for an acquisition or something to come up where there would be a special charge, and they could then hide all their problems in the special charge.
Right, exactly. But as, we could discuss, the cash taxes, just like on the book side. The book side's the regular accounting, so there's a tax side and a book side. First of all, those two numbers a lot of the times aren't close to the same numbers. And, when you look at taxes, if you go look at a 10K, which is pretty boring, and you look at their tax footnote, you'll see that they'll have a tax rate. This was relevant in some of the companies like Apple or whatever. And they say, oh, they pay a lot of taxes. Their rate's 26% or 20, whatever it is. But that doesn't mean that's what their cash taxes is. That's, quote unquote, the taxes they book, for, which may not be the same as cash.
Got it. So in the 80s and 90s, when you started working with him, there were a ton of probably more conglomerates around, and I guess for people that don't know what that is, I guess I would describe as a conglomerate as a company that is in various different types of business. GE,
Right.
The original GE would be the best example of that,
Exactly.
where they were in everything from capital to aircraft engines to refrigerators and light bulbs.
To rail cars.
To rail cars. And what were Carl's views on conglomerates and the people that manage them?
Well, his usual view was that there's too many managers in these conglomerates. And even if it wasn't a conglomerate, but especially if it was a conglomerate, there was usually a layer of, let's call it middle management, that he saw. He would go in and say, and talk to him and say, I have no idea what you guys are doing. And he would get rid of them. So, for example, ACF, the first one, they were primarily a rail car sales and leasing company. They also owned a carburetor company, and they owned an oil and gas drilling company. And ultimately, Carl sold those, partly to repay debt and partly because he didn't want to be in those businesses.
Yeah, I saw something where they asked him about management, and he said, well, they're all scratch golfers.
Well, there's scratch golfers, then there's me.
Okay.
And it goes into the quick story of I try to play golf various times. and I'm scratch, but I'm not a golfer. And he would call me. I had a friend who innately knew when Carl was going to call me on the golf course, and even on a Saturday. And Carl would call. I'd have to pick my ball up, so my score wasn't bad. But Carl would call and say, Bleznick, why are you playing golf? Are you any good? I said, not really. He says, so why are you wasting your time? But if I said I was good, he would have said, you're spending too much time playing golf. There was no answer to that. I played golf. I was mediocre. But he had no tolerance for what he called the country club types, which are the golf types. He did like tennis. Tennis was okay.
Well, tennis didn't take 4 hours to play.
Right. You weren't out of, but it never failed that something would happen.
So you spent almost 20 years with Carl as your primary client when you were at Gordon Altman, is that right?
Right.
The first firm? And then when that firm blew up, you went to Piper Rudnick?
Yeah, what happened was in the late 90s, law was changing, bigger firms were happening, so one of our practice groups, investment companies, went to another big firm, like a real big firm. And, losing that, the problem with the Carl work was it was great work. It's about the best you can ask for a guy like me, is he's transactional. So a mutual fund's not transactional. They do everything every quarter. So when we lost our mutual fund client, we really had no hedge, against the fact that there would be months where Carl didn't do much. It was an ebb and flow type of thing. So the firm folded, and our tax department went into Piper Rudnick, which today is called DLA Piper.
And then after a few years of that, Carl pursued you to come in-house.
Correct. On September, right in the beginning of September of 2001, right before 9/11, I saw him at a function. I was on crutches. I had broken my ankle. And he came up to me. He says, I need to talk to you. That's all he said. I said, okay, fine, we'll talk. Then 9/11 happened. Things got dropped for a while. Then early in the following year, which is '02, he called me in. And he had a couple of his senior guys there. And they asked me to work for him. And I thought about it. I thought, ultimately it was a great thing to do, because I'm not the kind of guy, I view myself as a guy that's somewhat good at problem solving, somewhat good at structuring deals. I could maybe get clients, but it would have taken some time for me to develop. So I didn't have to worry. I would have one client, Carl and all his companies. So it struck me as a pretty good idea, and I had to agree with Carl. Carl, because he says you're in charge of all tax items, anything with the word tax on it. It's an income tax, a sales tax. It's mostly income tax. So the one thing that if you want me to move on, the one thing
you talk about whatever. I'm not making you move faster, slower, or in between. I have no agenda here on the time. So
one thing was I had been a junior partner in a law firm, and didn't have my own client base, which wasn't atypical when you were a junior partner. But coming into Carl, I said, after being in a partnership, a law partnership, and practicing law, I don't want to report to anybody. He says, what about me? I said, I'll report to you. Okay, but I don't want to report to the CFO or the general counsel or the CEO. I thought that was a very important thing. He agreed with me. He says, no, you talk to me. It's my, because he looked at it as his money. Icahn Enterprises he owned most of it. So he looked at it as like, just so happens it was in the billions, not the millions. But he looked at it as his money. And so he wanted someone to keep track of it.
So I assume reporting directly to him was not just an ego thing. It was, let me say my own perspective. When I was a GC, whenever there was something in the deal I completely didn't understand, I'd go talk to the tax people because I figured they had done it, and they usually did. And they would have to, tell me, now don't trade this. So is that part of the reason you wanted to report directly to him, to be able to avoid those kind of having to explain to the dumb GC? Not that your GC was dumb, but
that's part of it. But a large part of it was what I proposed in deals, whether it was true or not. It really wasn't true, but it doesn't matter. Tax lawyers, transactionally, are can maybe muck up a deal because they add a couple steps to the deal. They add, you can't do it this way, you have to do it a different way because you need a tax benefit. And I felt that there would be situations where I would just be vetoed. If I had to go through this CFO, the best person to make the argument for the work I did was me. If you go to a CFO, first of all, they don't understand it, or rarely understand it. I'm not bagging on, I'm not trying to be Carl, but you have a CFO or a CEO and or a general counsel, they're not your best advocate. And that ultimately was important to me.
Well, yeah, because if somebody asked me, well, why are we doing this way? Why are we doing this step? Couldn't we skip these 3-4 steps?
Yeah.
I'd be like, well, I don't know. The tax guy put this in.
Right.
Yeah. I wasn't there to advocate. I would just say that's where it came from. Right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Was Carl fun to work with?
90% of the time, he was very entertaining. And I told him, I said, I think you're the funniest billionaire, because he didn't care what he said for the most part. He wasn't politically correct. He would imitate people, not in exactly the most favorable light. But sometimes he picked a guy whether it was me or somebody else, and he didn't like something you did or something you said, and he'd be on your case for like relentless for a while. And that was not fun. But I would say 90% of the time, working on deals and all that stuff. And it was a very real place. It was a very flat organization. I had a lot of people reporting to me, but they weren't in the main office. They were like the operating companies that we controlled. I had an internal tax staff of about 6 or 7 people.
Were there any other than reporting to Carl directly and whatever compensation you agreed on, were there any other conditions you set on what's required to get you in-house?
Right. One of the conditions was I had told Carl I was recently divorced. I had 3 relatively young sons. Carl's a late owl. He would never get in the morning. He would get in the afternoon. And invariably, I had the good night policy. That was the big one. I had to say good night to him and if he didn't see the good night, like if you waved your hand, you got no affirmative reaction, that didn't count as a good night. So my sons were young. I was divorced. So I said, Carl, every Wednesday I take my kids, and other days, Wednesday, Friday, I take my sons out to dinner. I have to leave a little early. And he agreed to that. It was better telling him up front rather than taking the pain later.
And then Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes showed up on a Wednesday?
Well, no, Friday. It was Wednesday,
okay.
Sometimes Friday.
Okay.
But yeah, we were told, Leslie Stahl did a piece called the Icahn Lift, which we could, elaborate. But Leslie Stahl, we were told not to leave our office on the executive floor where Carl was. My office was about 25 feet from Carl's. We were told not to leave the office until 7 o'clock on Friday because he wanted to do a walkthrough with Leslie Stahl. And it was 7:30, it was 8 o'clock. I finally said, my kids are calling me every 2 minutes. I finally said, I'm going to leave. It's 8 o'clock. I went home, took my kids to dinner. A few months later, none of the guys in the office told me this. A few months later, I'm watching the piece. It was bumped for an Obama piece, so it must have been '08 or something like that.
Right.
And they show Leslie and Carl walking down the hall of the main, floor, and then there's a dark office. And Carl said, and Leslie was saying over and over how late everybody worked. Carl's like, well, he didn't work very late. We're going to have to get to the bottom of this. And somehow he didn't remember it was my office, or he didn't say it. But, a lot of people noticed. They called me and said, Bleznick, that had to be you.
No one else had the guts to leave
No
early.
one had the guts. Some people could say stupidity, but guts is good.
It takes a certain breed of stock market investor, the kind with lots of money and lots of guts, to thrive in queasy times like these, when the market keeps losing altitude. Carl Icahn is one of that breed. He has a knack for turning someone else's loss into profit for himself. But he can also help others improve their bottom line through the so-called Icahn lift. Icahn, along with his son and 40 other analysts and lawyers in the firm, work long hours looking for more companies to target.
And these guys do a great job. Somebody left. I don't know who that is. I'll find out.
That name. They also work on Icahn's $8 billion hedge fund.
So you talked about the Icahn lift.
Correct.
What was that?
Well, and this has gone for many, many years. So Carl, in step one of his methodology, which was not unique, but for him it was because of the amounts of shares he bought, you didn't have to file with the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, until you hit 5%. You didn't have to tell anybody what your interest was. And so he would accumulate stock. He also used some swaps, but let's just call it stock for now. And then he would hit 5%, or in certain other situations, he would make an announcement that he owned such and such a company. Whenever Carl did that, or whenever that announcement was made, the stock typically went up that day. It could be 5 to 10%. It wasn't like nothing. It was a decent bump. And it was, so that was called the Icahn lift. The thing is, he couldn't really buy on the Icahn lift, right? So, because, he's now telling the world that he owns these shares. He's driving up the price of the shares he's trying to buy.
He's making it more expensive for himself.
Yeah, exactly. That's a reverse corporator. But so that was the methodology he used.
So he'd accumulate a stock position and then very publicly threaten through letter writing.
All you had to do was disclose that he owned the stock.
Okay.
You didn't have to say anything else, because he never went into a stock just to invest in it. He went into a stock to be an activist, to tell them how bad they were and what was wrong with them. And a lot of times he was right. So he'd go in and the shares would take a bump.
And generally he didn't have anything other than publicly. You guys were studying 10Ks.
Well, within reason, maybe the rules changed over the last 40 years as to what's public and non-public.
Right.
I mean, for example, in tax, really depended on the 10Ks. Now, the 10Ks, the annual reports, same thing. Those are always publicly filed. If they did anything unusual, they would file something, an 8K or whatever. But, Carl knew a lot of people, and it came to the point where people would ask Carl to get involved in things because of his notoriety. So, I think Carl got information, not illicitly, but just because of who he was and his reputation, people would talk to him.
Yeah, when was it that Reg FD came in? FD standing for Fair Disclosure. I think it was like 2002?
Yeah, something like that. I'm not...
And it may have been before. It might have actually been before that.
Right.
I just know it came the year before Sarbanes-Oxley, and we were...
Right.
We thought FD was a pain, and then Sarbanes came. We were like,
Sarbanes was
oh.
very annoying.
Yeah. So what were you, examining public information, looking at public filings, what were you and Carl seeing that other people were missing?
Well, the simple one is what I'm seeing. Very rarely was there a guy like me, and I had a couple other people that worked with me on this. Did people look at the tax assets? Sometimes they did, but a lot of times they didn't. And for accounting purposes, there's something where, let's say you had a big net operating loss. If the company wasn't expected to use that loss because it was losing money, they would write that loss off. It was called a valuation allowance. And they would say the losses were zero. So anybody looking at it without any kind of tax overlay is going to say, well, this loss ain't worth very much. Carl, he just put together, the company. In other words, he'd look at a target, they might have a lawsuit against them, the judgment in one case, they might be a conglomerate, and he's saying, well, if one company like, eBay spins off PayPal, it's a no-brainer that they should. Some of these ideas, he didn't necessarily be the first person, but he was the first person they took seriously.
Okay.
So it was a combination, but eventually he'd file, he'd start writing letters, and he'd talk to the company and that type of stuff. Most of the time, in a hostile situation, we ended up with at least 2 directors, but that wasn't a controlling interest.
But you couldn't be ignored. You had a seat on the board.
We had a seat on the board. Well, it was very good because in theory, your directors. Carl never, in the later years, never was a director. He put on one of his lieutenants. But it was a very good way indirectly. The board has certain, fiduciary duties. But within reason, the board can overlook everything, in terms of they know what Carl would want.
Got it.
I'm not saying that they did anything wrong, but they obviously had that mindset.
So you mentioned American Car and Foundry before, the rail car manufacturer that he bought in '84, and I guess it wasn't very profitable when he bought it.